It's the most wonderful time of year. I'm speaking, of course, about Election Day. The 2021 general elections are upon us. But what if I told you that local and judicial elections may impact your life more than last year's presidential race? But who are the people running and what kinds of questions should we be asking them? Those are the questions that attorney Frank DeVito and I will be discussing coming up right here, right now. My name is Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Election season is upon us again. But in odd years like 2021, many of us are voting for local races and for statewide judicial candidates. So who are these candidates and what kinds of questions should you be asking? What issues are appropriate? Frank DeVito is an attorney and a board member of the Northampton County Elections Commission, and he joins us tonight to break down these races. Frank, welcome to Face the Issues.
Thanks, Sam. Good to be back.
It's good to have you, this time in studio.
Yes.
Let's jump in. It's election year. Every year is election year. Let's start with that. And not just every 4 years. Every year is election year, as you well know. This year for Pennsylvania voters, for our New Jersey viewers, they're going to be electing a governor. We don't have to hype that race up for them. They know the stakes there. But for our viewers in Pennsylvania, the biggest tickets are these statewide judicial seats. And then through the counties, we have executive races, commissioner races, mayors, township races, and so forth. I want to ask you just in general, what is the importance of local politics and local government? We have such a heavy emphasis on what Congress does and what the White House does, and not a huge emphasis on what happens locally. What is the importance of that?
Sure. There are two different ways that I would answer that question. So first of all, there are just local issues that have a tremendous impact on the daily lives of people. You know, a lot of the, especially in Pennsylvania and in our counties, very heavily taxed on our property at the county level, the local level, as well as the school district. So those are all local and county situations. And a lot of small policies, taxes are the ones that come to mind most, right? Taxing and spending. That affect the daily lives of people more than they might realize. And because the elections are so much smaller, you actually have more of a say. You have the ability to go to your town or county council, participate, be heard, and state your case to the people who are making these decisions, whereas Congress, not so much. But the other thing I would say on that point is that if you care more about the big, Congress and the president and the high level issues, it makes sense. But a lot of the issues that people felt very passionately about in the wake of the 2020 election, especially voter fraud concerns and the like, those are affected tremendously by these state and local elections, right? Because the judges that heard almost all of these election fraud claims are state and local judges. The voter registrars, the voter offices that count and administer the voting system, those are usually town and county offices. So if you care about the big picture, it's the local politicians in the local offices mostly that control what happens.
Right. Interesting. So you're saying that there are things that we talk about, we argue about, that we may assign to the federal government, taxes, for example, where the federal government may not have a say, in that we don't pay a federal property tax. We don't pay a federal sales tax. And a lot of times these are things that we yell about, but the only tax we're really paying to the federal government is an income tax. And you're saying that these are things that we deal with at the state and local level, and a lot of the people who are complaining about these things don't actually get involved and vote on an issue that they're actually upset about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just look at the voter numbers, right? Like in 2020, the voter turnout in our county was in the 70s, I think 75, maybe 80%, and your average local election, 20%, 25 maybe of the voters actually turn out to vote.
Right. I remember in the year Mayor Pulaski was indicted by he was investigated by the FBI, and the charges came down that year in the primary with a mayor running that was facing these charges. Turnout, I believe, in the Democrat primary was about 4%, and the Republican was about 3%. And so much different than the presidential year, to your point. Frank, let me ask you about this. there are a lot of times, you said that these are local issues, that some of these issues are just straight up local. Driver's licensing is not a national issue. Property taxes, not a national issue. School boards, anything that deals, if your school is going to build a new stadium or something, that's not something that's a national issue. Then you said there's issues that are national issues, but they are applied here locally. Even to the degree of how do we use federal stimulus dollars? How do we use federal CARES Act dollars? What role do you think federal politics has in these local elections? I think a lot of times when you watch these races unfold, you hear people talking about the withdrawal of Afghanistan, or they talk about being pro-choice or pro-life. They talk about critical race theory, things like this. What role do these national hot button topics play at a local level?
Yeah, the good lawyer's answer is it depends. It depends on the local or county office that you're talking about, and it depends on the issue you're talking about, right? Because some of the national hot button issues right now are relevant to certain local offices. Like you would want to know what your school board candidates think about critical race theory and curricula, about COVID, mask policies for children, but you wouldn't need to know what they think about, like we were talking about before, the Afghanistan withdrawal or abortion policy, because those things don't factor in at all to what a school board does. And I would say, especially when you're talking about the town or county council, right, the legislative branches on the local level, the biggest kind of big picture federal policy that we talk about where you would care is tax and spend, right? What are these people's views on how eager are they to tax? How much are they willing to raise or lower taxes? What are they willing to spend government dollars on? Those things are absolutely relevant because the local and county governments tax and spend. How often does a local or a county government make a decision on, say, abortion or marriage? Pretty much never, right?
Or invading a foreign country.
Right, yeah, no, we don't have much jurisdiction on the county level on what we do in Afghanistan. Yeah.
Let me ask you this. I think we hear about trends. And so the Republican Party, people are upset about the Republican Party at the national level is generally where this anger comes from. Then we see it play out in local elections. Does that concern you at all, that the national partisan trending seems to play out in local races?
The fact that national hot button issues trickle down and play, yeah, absolutely, because you have the concerns with election fraud that were propagated by then President Trump, right, in the aftermath of the November election, they've trickled down. You have Republican voters who don't want to vote because they don't think the vote counts or the system is rigged, and that's not good. But at the same time, I would say there is a benefit to the trickle down of national interest to local politics because hopefully it gets people riled up to actually care enough about the issues going on in their community to maybe realize, like I'm saying, the impact that these local and county and state candidates can have, and will maybe get out and vote.
So you're hoping this brings out more people to vote.
Absolutely.
We just have to kind of shift their attention toward local issues.
Right.
Frank, let me ask you this. When if someone were to come to you and ask, I'm not going to ask you who people should vote for, but what questions would you encourage them to ask of, like a local candidate might knock on your door. How would you encourage a voter to engage that conversation?
Great. Well, the first thing is I think citizens should try at least a little bit. I know it's hard to find information, but at least know a little bit about what offices are up for election and what those people do. And the easiest way to do that, at least in Pennsylvania, go to your county website and look at each office. If there are county council candidates up for election, go to county council's page and you'll see a few paragraphs about what they do, what they vote on. And that's a good starting point because then you know what to engage them on. You know, like in Northampton County where I live, the county administers a public nursing home. So I'd want to know what the candidates think about funding and staffing and policy there. Property taxes, absolutely, budgeting, county employees. So it depends. I would want to know enough about the office where if someone came knocking, I know what that office does.
Right. Yeah, and to your point, not all the offices, local offices, we kind of group them together in local elections. Not all the local offices do the same thing. There are legislators, there are executives, and then there are those who are not. There are controllers, treasurers, prothonotary. I think President Truman said prothonotary was the most dignified title in American politics.
Yeah.
To your point, they do different things. When you talk to these candidates who are running, I mean, one of the challenges that we hear, and we jokingly titled this, "Who Are These People?" We all know the national figures, and it seems to be harder and harder to know your local elected officials and candidates. even though by design they represent fewer people, they're supposed to be in the community. A lot of these are part-time positions, so the idea they're supposed to be citizen legislators. How do we go about getting to know these people? Where can we find them or find more information about them?
Yeah, I think there's a big modern issue in that typically, right, our founding fathers would have been quite used to a robust local press, right? You would have newspapers and periodicals, and people would know the candidates because they'd be writing, they'd be having written debates, right? And we don't have the same kind of reporting. People get most of the news from social media, which is increasingly national and international. So it's hard to find. I think one of the easiest or the best things you can do, if you're affiliated with a party, especially your local county Democrat or Republican party, they typically have meetings, or they at least have a page. You can reach out to their leadership and they'll be able to give you names of candidates, events that they might be at, and ways to get involved. I think usually the local party is probably the best way to find out about candidates.
Get me. And to your point, the local press, we had Tom Shortell, who's formerly the Morning Call here several months ago, talking about just the more press becomes nationalized, who covers the community? How do we even know what's going to be going on in that community? Last question on this segment, Frank. We talked about the importance of national issues and local issues. We talked about the importance of local roles in these national issues. Where does partisanship play in this? I mean, at some level, with the federal level, there is a sense of, if I don't like the candidate, at least if the party wins, they have control of the House or the Senate or so forth. How much should this national partisan identity impact how we see local elections?
I think less, because on the local level, first of all, you'll have candidates who maybe defy the national party line. You might have more conservative Democrats, more moderate Republicans in a local or a county race than you would elsewhere. So I think you should really be voting much more on a particular person and the issues than on a party at the local level.
Do you think it's something that is doable in our charged climate? Let me put it this way, do you still have hope that the voting public can get to know a candidate and vote on that candidate and not just on their party lines?
You know I do, because of how the elections play out. Like, even if you look at 2020, where President Trump was underperformed a lot of state candidates. You know, the Republican candidate for Auditor General and for Treasurer both got in, and a lot of local and state candidates got in even though the president lost. So people are obviously paying attention and not just voting party line.
Yeah,
that's encouraging.
That's a good insight, and that's good advice, given the opportunity to really get to know the candidates running. So Frank, thank you for that. When we come back, I want to talk about judicial races. You're an attorney. I want to pick your brain on that. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Frank, thank you again for joining us. I want to shift the conversation now to judicial elections. You're an attorney. This is something you understand very well. In Pennsylvania, in many states, there are judicial elections. In our state, they are partisan judicial elections, meaning that these candidates run with a party affiliation. Let me start by asking you, you mentioned in the first segment that the questions we ask of these local candidates should be determined by what role they're running for. That a county commissioner and, say, a township supervisor or a county treasurer might have very, very different roles. What is the role of a judge?
That's a great question. So the role of a judge is to interpret what the law says, what a particular law, a constitution or a statute typically, what it means and how it applies to a certain set of facts. So which is tricky, especially for non-lawyers, to look at candidates and decipher, because for me, I'm looking less at political issues. You know, what does this judge think about, criminal law or this or that, but how does this judge read law? How is he going to do his job?
So in the last segment, you said that national talking points should matter less in these local races. What role does it have in the judicial race?
In some sense, none. In some sense, a lot. So none in that, personally, I don't think most of the policy questions that are hot buttons, right, from CRT to abortion to war, I wouldn't really care what a judicial candidate thinks about those. But at the same time, especially in the last few years, as debate has heated up on Supreme Court nominees, for example, there's been a lot of talk about originalism, textualism, judicial philosophies, right? What is a judge thinking when he looks at a law, and how does he apply it? And that has 100% carryover, because local judges are reading constitutions and statutes just like Supreme Court justices are.
So you're splitting this not as a federal local issue here. You're splitting this as a public policy / political versus a judicial kind of question. In this situation, then, if our voters shouldn't be asking of judges, are you pro-life, pro-choice? Do you support the war in Afghanistan? What do you think about taxes? What kinds of questions should they be looking for, should they be asking?
So the one question I would ask, and this kind of breaks down my interest in judicial philosophy, it's like an understandable level. If a judicial candidate knocked on my door, one of the most interesting questions I think I could ask, and I don't know if I'd get an honest answer, but would be, if you were faced with a law that you were asked to rule on, and you thought it went a certain way, but you didn't like the outcome, explain to me what you would do, how that would go. And one of the great examples of this, sorry to give you a federal answer, but Justice Scalia, when he was alive, talked about this a lot. The one case that he would always cite was the flag burning case. So he heard a case where a man was prosecuted for burning an American flag, and Scalia sided with the liberals, saying that that's covered under the First Amendment. That's protected political speech. And in commentary, Scalia said, well, if I were king, I would have thrown that guy in jail, you know, but I'm not king. I have to read the First Amendment and see what it actually means and how it applies, not what I want the outcome to be. So for me, that's pretty much the question.
The question. Frank, that reminds me of Justice Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, when he was appointed, had that famous line that lawyers and constitutional scholars always quote now. He says, a judge that agrees with every decision he reaches is likely a very bad judge, reaching for personal preferences beyond what the law compels. This is something that's very difficult for the voter to swallow, though, in the sense that we vote on, our representatives are supposed to represent us. This is a difficult pill to swallow. Why should we not be putting these policy or political views on our judges?
Sure. So it's a hard question, because you want the judges that you're voting for to side with what you think are the right outcomes.
Right.
But the problem is, the laws are enacted by the legislature. You want judges who are going to enforce those laws as written, because we as citizens are bound by those laws, right? If I'm a small landlord and my tenant sues me for something, or if I'm accused of a crime, I want a judge sitting at that bench who follows what the law says, because if I'm a citizen, I'm going to try to obey the laws as they're written. If I'm going to go in and I'm going to get a judge who, whether on the left or on the right, is going to push his policy preference in an outcome that affects my life directly, my money or my freedom, I want that judge to be following the law as strictly and honestly as possible.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. And so what you're saying is this is really it cuts both ways. I mean, conservatives, they may want judges who are politically conservative, but what would happen if you had a judge who decided to ignore the law and use a politically liberal interpretation instead, and vice versa? Liberals who may want progressive judges, but what would you think of a judge who says, I'm a conservative, we're going to ignore the law, we're going to do this instead? There needs to be some kind of standard. Is that what I'm getting at?
Yeah, you want the standard because you want the consistency of application of the law, but also there's a really disturbing precedent that's set. If conservatives want conservative judges who will just push conservative outcomes, but then you're setting a precedent where you want the judge to do what you want policy-wise, regardless of what the law says. So then when your judge candidates lose and the people from the other side of the political aisle start to get elected, they have a precedent that, well, the other side does it, right? They push their policy. Who cares what the law says? That's very dangerous. You know, we don't want to cut down the laws in the name of getting our policy preferences, because then the laws are flat, and what's going to protect us? Sure.
And does that make I mean, I've heard this argument, does that make the judiciary in many ways like a legislature? If
they're enacting policy decisions, absolutely. And that should frighten us, because while they are elected officials in this state, they're not the same way. They're not responsive to the people, and they ought not to be. Their job should be to make decisions based on the law, not on popularity, and to have that kind of stability. You know, we elect legislatures, and those legislators go in, they vote, they pass policies. If we don't like them, we replace them. That ought not to be how judges are. They shouldn't have to be so sensitive to public opinion, because that's not their job.
Right. And this is, to your point, this is something that Madison separated out in the Constitution for a reason, on purpose, that the legislature should be, I mean, to be honest, rowdy and heated, and throwing ideas around and arguing about ideas. And the judiciary should really be separated out from that, an independent judiciary, as John Locke would argue for. Along those lines, in our state, Frank, as you know, we have partisan election judges, so we do attach a political party to it. Curious as to your take on that. And I mean, because obviously the party is going to support its judges, and Democrat Party will support its judges. Helpful, not helpful?
I think it's more helpful in the higher up elections. So for example, when you have Supreme Court, Pennsylvania Supreme Court elections, it's more likely that your Republican candidates, and this isn't certain, but more likely that they will be textualist originalists, because that's a trend among conservative lawyers and judges. So at that high level of appeals courts, chances are a Republican judge leans more toward that judicial philosophy, Democrat judges less so. There's still some wiggle room there. But I think it gets more confusing when you get down to like a county trial judge, or especially like a local magistrate, because those things don't tend to apply so much, because you just have the candidates for county judge are lawyers from the county, and they might be Democrats or Republicans, but whether they're, a solid textualist or they subscribe to this academic, legal scholar, that's probably not even on the table. These are just lawyers who practice law. And so it might not tell you that much what party they're in as to how they're going to judge.
So what's your advice? I mean, whether it's judicial races or local candidates, like what's your advice to voters heading into this election? I mean, because the parties spend a lot of the money in the local race trying to get their candidates across the board. We have national issues that dominate local races, and then turnout is down.
Yeah.
And so what's your advice to somebody who's thinking about voting, about should they vote, and how do they parse through these different roles? What should they be doing in trying to get those answers?
Yeah, so in general, and then especially with judges, because that's what we're talking about, do a little bit of homework. We don't have local newspapers with the same robustness of local coverage, but we do have Google, which does take us a certain distance. So you can, Google your county judge races, who's running. You'll get a little bit. You'll get something about party affiliation, their lawyer background, what they do. It's better than nothing. And same thing with the other candidates. So you start with an internet search, reach out to your local political party. They'll be able to give you information. And I know not everybody has the time that maybe you or I devote to political issues, but a little bit of time can still give you at least enough to make an informed decision. I would say absolutely vote, because like you said, the numbers are down of people who actually vote in these elections, so your vote goes a longer way.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Your vote is in many ways worth more when there's less people that are voting. Yeah. So, Frank, what's your hope? I mean, you're on the Northampton County Election Commission. We've been talking about the lower numbers. What is your hope when you look at local races? What's the great hope as far as those turnout numbers and how we approach it? My hope is that we can figure out, this might answer your question, how to use the social media, digital world that we now live in to have more local candidates engage citizens, but on local issues, right? Because a lot of people will use their local candidacy to talk about whatever national issue. But I would love to see people use their Facebook pages, their YouTube channels to actually engage voters and say, here, if you're interested in what county government does and what I would do in the county, here's a video on, fiscal policy, on taxes, on the local nursing home and how I would run it. That's what I would love to see. And I think that would engage more voters if they could actually see who these candidates are. Sure. I think that's great advice. And that does fall both the candidates and the voters to engage each other more. So, Frank, thank you for your time. Thank you for talking about this. I think there's so much attention paid to national politics that we forget sometimes the importance of these races, and appreciate you taking the time to do that. I'm happy to. Thank you. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Frank, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for talking about this. I want to talk a little bit, third segment, we like to know the guests a little bit better. One of the things that you're big on, yes, you are an attorney, yes, you are involved in local civics, but for you, a lot of this stems from your devotion to your family, your devotion to community. Talk to me about that and where that impacts your politics. Sure, thank you. So where that comes from, I'm a Catholic, so the Catholic principle of subsidiarity is basically things are usually best done on as local a level as possible. That's where the most change is effected, the most gets done. Right, so I'm a husband, I'm a father, I have 3 little kids, I'm heavily involved in our church. I actually know my neighbors, my kids play with the neighbors' kids, we talk to them in the backyard. And I think that's important, especially in this conversation we've had today about the importance of local politics. And I had said earlier in the earlier segment that, with town council, you can go to the meeting and you can engage those people. You can maybe change their mind, you can convey something about what you think. Congress, you can't, right? So the same thing, I know so many people who get so wrapped up in national issues, election issues, and policy issues, and it's fine, it's good to be informed on those things, but your ability to affect change is so small, whereas just think about your family. I think in my own house, we intentionally don't have a television. We read and tell stories. We sing and dance with our kids. And I just think if you really make yourselves, as parents especially, the prime educators and formators of your kids,
you're affecting the next generation of citizens, of members of society. And same thing, you can know your neighbors, you can know the people in your church, you can love them and serve them and work with them, and that affects radical change in a community. So I think it's just, that's something I'm passionate about. I always pitch to everybody, you can do more to change the world in your family and in your neighborhood than you ever can in big time politics.
Right. And even, I think about Aristotle in book 1 of his Politics, and he talks about these factors that socialize and normalize us. And he talks about the city, the government, the polis, but he also talks about the community or the village and the family as being the first and second things that really normalize us, to your point. And so where do you think that starts? So what advice would you give people who are watching this today, who, as you know, we're oftentimes on social media yelling about these political issues. What advice do you give them as to how they can begin to invest back in their families and their communities?
Yeah, the first thing is to unplug and focus on the people who are physically in front of you. I think it's so easy. Even I'm, subject to this too. You get home, you're tired after work, and the phone comes out. But you have people in front of you. For me, it's the little kids who are climbing up me and my wife. But just by taking the phone, I put it in another room as often as I can and play with the kids, tell stories, talk to my wife, and just that. I think unplug and engage with the people who are physically around you is the best advice to start to make yourself more of a local change agent, I suppose.
What a great word of advice, unplug. Frank, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for what you do and for the example that you set.
I'm always happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. That is our show for tonight. I want to thank attorney Frank DeVito for joining us and for breaking down these incredibly important issues. And I want to thank you for joining in as well. And we hope to see you right back here again next week. Until then, my name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.